Introduce Angela. Are you ready, Angela?
Yes, just one second. She just left. Janice came on, didn't she?
Yeah.
There's Janice.
Okay, I'm fine.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I don't know if you can see the sign. We're happy to have you here this evening for Angela Bates' presentation of Children of the Promised Land. Our program is brought to us by Humanities Kansas. Here's the sign. An independent nonprofit spearheading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. So this evening we have Angela Bates. She is a Nicodemus descendant and historian, and she is the executive director and founder of the Nicodemus Historical Society. Working with the Nicodemus community, the National Park Service, and Senators Dole and Roberts, she helped designate Nicodemus as a National Historic Site. Angela presents educational programs to cultural organizations across the nation, covering the history of Nicodemus, exodusters, and Black towns in the West, Buffalo soldiers, and Black women in the West. Her series of children's books, Adventures of Nicodemus Annie, focus on the history of Nicodemus. And she has been with the Humanities Speakers Bureau since 2010. So welcome, Angela. I appreciate you coming out this evening, or kind of coming out, being online this evening.
Being safe.
Being safe and warm.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be invited to speak about my own personal passion and my own family. So the history of Nicodemus is obviously important to the nation, but it's definitely important to me and my family. And I feel very fortunate enough to be a part of this story, and to be able to share it is a wonderful thing. So it always pleases me to be invited to speak about something that is dear to my heart and to my family specifically, but and more importantly, the history of Nicodemus is really significant to the nation. So tonight, what I'm going to do is talk to you all about the Children of the Promised Land. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that project came into being, and now it's this PowerPoint presentation that I'm doing. But back in 2010, I decided that I didn't want to do newsletters for the year. What I wanted to do was give our patrons and our friends and family an opportunity to really see what we had in our collection. Over the years, we've collected historical photographs and all kinds of documents and manuscripts and what have you. So I thought, rather than doing a newsletter that year, I would take the opportunity to pull photographs from our collection and put them together in a book that would allow people to see the kinds of photographs that we had in our collection. And so it started out as a big project, and I said, oh, what shall we put in here? And it was just too big to try to grapple with. So I said, I need to narrow this down. And I decided to do a focus on strictly the photographs and strictly the children in particular. I really wanted to start with the children, because a lot of times we talk about the men and we talk about the women, we talk about the icons, but we don't talk about the children. And so I went through about 500 photographs that we had and narrowed it down to about 205 or 6, and selected those photographs to go into this book that I called Children of the Promised Land. These were the first and second generation of children born into freedom. Some of these children that came to Nicodemus were born into slavery, but their parents obviously were former slaves, but they also had siblings that were born after they arrived in Nicodemus. So this is the first and second generation of children born into freedom on the free soils of Kansas. It is also an opportunity with this book. I really wanted to contrast what it was like for the parents, and in particular the mothers of these children. what was it like before emancipation, rearing their children, having their children, what it was like to be a parent of these children versus now that they were emancipated, what was it going to be like for them as parents and having children that were going to be born free. So I really wanted to highlight that aspect of the history because it's unexplored, so to speak. And I thought it would be really interesting for people to get an idea and get a glimpse on what it was like for these women as well, these mothers as well as their children growing up during slavery and some of them being born into freedom. So the book was called Children of the Promised Land. So that is also the title of the presentation. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start out with what I wrote in the beginning as a part of the introduction to give you an idea of what I'm going to be exploring and what it is going to give you the insight into this mindset of the mother and the children that were actually born in freedom, and some of them that came to Nicodemus as children. So I'm going to just read from you, put in the introduction. In the fall of 1877, young, pregnant Emma Johnson Williams traveled to an unknown land. Where her siblings and parents, she journeyed to Nicodemus, far beyond the horizon of what was familiar and known to her and her parents as former slaves on the plantation of Vice President Richard M. Johnson of Georgetown, Kentucky. Now, Vice President Richard M. Johnson was the vice president under President Van Buren. And so Emma is my great grandmother that actually came and settled here at Nicodemus. So this is literally, this little introduction is about her. Emma traveled without her husband, Charles, who had promised to meet her at Nicodemus in the spring. To know her child would be born on free soil must have replaced any apprehension she felt facing the unknown. When she gave birth to the first child of Nicodemus, a child born to experience freedom, shouts of joy must have rung across the barren, windswept Kansas prairie. The angels of heaven must have sung a song of joy while the spirits of our ancestors celebrated with great jubilee. The birth of a strong boy during that harsh fall of 1877 was a sign of the strong will required to face the challenges and hardships ahead. As a new mother and pioneer woman, Emma met those challenges and hardships with raw tenacity and a strong faith in God. She had survived childbirth and was proud to give birth to the firstborn child of Nicodemus. God himself must have been pleased when those first cries rang out, letting heaven and earth know that this tiny babe was one of the first generation of African-American children born free on the free soils of Kansas. This firstborn was named Henry after his uncle. On that late October day when little Henry took his first breath, burning buffalo chips used as fuel, dirt from the dugout where he was born, and his mother's warm skin were his first scents. Light that flickered from a nearby candle or lamp was the first light to his tiny eyes. Beyond the sounds of loving voices, his ears must have heard the cry of a lone wolf, the sweet song of a Kansas meadowlark, or the cooing of a dove, or perhaps the screech of a red-tailed hawk. Kansas welcomed him as he welcomed his first breath in this new world. And that is how it began in Nicodemus, October the 30th, 1877, on the free soils in the promised lands of Kansas. Hopefully that kind of sets the stage for you in terms of who Emma was and her giving birth to the first baby born, her first child being born into freedom, and she herself had been a former slave. I'm going to share my screen now and start my PowerPoint so you can begin to see some of these historic photographs that I had pulled for this particular PowerPoint. Now, can you see the entire screen, or do you see those little slides on the side? Should I make it an entire whole screen?
Yeah, go ahead and go to slideshow and,
Okay, where's my slideshow?
oh, it's up at the top next to transitions, animation, then slideshow.
Okay, it's, you know, it's got my, let me stop sharing the screen first because
Okay,
that menu is up there. Okay, let me stop that.
oh, I see. It's in the way, huh?
Yeah, so
Okay,
I'm just gonna do it now and then I'll share the screen.
okay.
Okay, okay, let me go back in here. Okay, you should be able to see it now. And I'll start it from the beginning. All righty.
Perfect.
Okay, so obviously we always want to, you know, thank our sponsor who basically is Humanities Kansas. I'm glad I am a speaker for them, and it has been very beneficial for me to be a member of the Speakers Bureau. I get a chance to speak to audiences all over the state. Okay, Children of the Promised Land, a matter of choice. So what I'm going to do here is give you a contrast between before they had a choice, which was during slavery, they did not have a choice. And then after emancipation, they had a choice. And they had a choice in all kinds of matters. During slavery, they had no choice. The mothers had no choice. And this is not, let me just make a statement here that there's exceptions to all rules. I'm just speaking in generalities here, and it varied from one plantation to the next and from one geographic area to the next. And so slavery that I'm talking about is like slavery in Kentucky, where the people came from. So it did vary, but women typically did not have a choice as to who their sexual partners were going to be, because they were not allowed to have any legal marriages. They didn't have any choice as to who their sexual partners were going to be and or their spouses. Many times the plantation owners would allow them to make those decisions, and many times they were allowed to pick their partners, and they would sometimes give them the opportunity to jump the broom, so to speak. Jumping the broom was a tradition that was brought over from Africa. African American people today still carry on that tradition of placing the broom down and jumping over it as a part of their marriage ceremony. But marriages were not legal during slavery. So they had no choice in the matter of who their sexual partners were and or who their spouses could potentially be. Many times they did not have the opportunity. They did not have the choice in naming their children. Many times the masters were the ones that gave them their name. And of course, if you lived on the Johnson plantation and then you were sold to the Bates plantation, the new plantation owner would have the right to say, you're no longer called Angela Johnson, you're called Angela Bates. And they could change the first name as well as the last name. So the parents really didn't have a choice in the matter of naming their children, but when they did, there was a common practice. They would name their daughters after their siblings, sisters if they had them, and or their master's siblings. And if I had a boy, for example, during slavery, I may name him after one of my brothers that was a sibling, or my master's brother. This was a common practice. It was one way that they could keep track of one another if they did get sold to a different plantation. And it proved to be very beneficial after emancipation when people were free to try to find their former children's or their spouses. They didn't have any, and let me give an example of a movie where you can see where they did not have an opportunity to name their children. The movie that was the sequel to Roots, which was called Queen, Halle Berry played Queen. Her mother was a slave in the slave quarters, And she was one of the women that the master chose to have sexual relationships. And so when she had the child, she wanted to name the little girl Princess. But the master, when he was actually recording the name in his logbook of his slaves, he named her Queen. So there is a perfect example of, and you can see that in that movie where they did not have a choice in naming their children. They didn't have an opportunity to really care for their children. If you worked in the field, so to speak, then your children were taken care of by the elderly women or the infirm women that were relegated to taking care of the children while the parents worked in the field. They didn't have any choice in the medical treatments. If their children were sick, and they would let their masters know, a lot of times they would make their own assessment and say, well, no, they're not sick enough to have any real treatment. So they had no control over their medical treatment. They had no control over their food. The food was given to them by their masters. And many times they were allowed to have their own gardens, but typically they did not determine what they were going to eat necessarily. Many times they would, depending on the plantation and the size of the plantation and the owner. They had no choice in their clothing. If you lived in and worked in the house, you got the hand-me-downs because the masters would want to make sure that their house slaves looked more decent and presentable than the slaves that worked in the field or lived in the quarters. Their households and living conditions, they had no control over that. If they were living in the quarters were exactly what the master wanted. Many of them just had a little fireplace and they really didn't have furniture. And if they did have furniture, it was very, very meager furniture. So they didn't have any choice over their living conditions. They had no control over their work. If your master wanted you to be relegated to the house and work in the house, that's where you went to work. And typically the ones that worked in the house were the mixed bloods. Those were the ones that were given the opportunity to live in the house and work in the house because they were the product of the master. And of course, that created all kinds of unique and very volatile situations, especially with the wives of the masters, because they had no choice themselves as women. If their husband decided they wanted to bring part of his concubine into the house, he did it. And the women that lived in the house that were part of his concubine, so to speak, were the ones that were usually treated the worst. You would think that that wouldn't be the case. But an example of that would be in that movie, if you saw it, and I highly recommend it, 12 Years a Slave, 12 Years a Slave, when the young lady on the plantation who was the sexual partner of the master, how she was treated by the mistress. And unlike, the mistress had no way to retaliate other than to take it out on her. And so those women, at many times, those women were very abused women. Again, they had no control over their own ownership. They could be sold at any time. If they were a part of an inheritance when their masters died, they went to whoever he bequeathed those children or those slaves to. So they didn't have any control over themselves, let alone rearing their children. So this kind of pretty much shows you that during slavery, there is no choice. Here's a photograph from the National Archives. This is typical of the large plantations where you would have the infirmed and older women taking care of the children, and the children that were too young to actually work in the fields. The ones that were were old enough to work, usually about 6 years old, 6, 7 years old. And sometimes before that, they would get sent to the house to be playmates and or to take care of the master's children. They would empty chamber pots, they would fan, they would do things like that. When they reached about 12 is when they would actually start working in the fields. See. Some of the fears that these children, as well as their parents, and especially the mothers had, was of separation, separating from their parents, from their siblings, and then maybe being separated in general by living in the house or working in the house and never having an opportunity to really be in the quarters with the rest of the slaves. Again, you could see that in the movie, the sequel to Roots, which was with Queen. She was taken, and there's a scene where she's taken from her mom and she's taken into the big house. And I think she's about 4 years old at the time. And from that point on, she stays in the big house and she doesn't get a chance to fraternize at all with the slaves in the quarter, not even her mother. So this fear of separation, whether from their parents or their siblings, or just being relegated to living and working in the house, was real fears. You could be sold anytime. So they live with that fear on a day-to-day basis. Beatings and perpetrators, you could be beat for a number of things, and that would happen. So they were always fearful of doing the wrong thing, getting caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. And then there was that fear of getting beat, or watching your children get beat, or you yourself being beat. So there was always that fear of perpetrators and the potential of getting beat. They were always fearful that they were not going to get enough food. That's a real fear that many of them had. The same thing with their clothing. Most slaves got their clothing given to them the first of the year. And if you outgrew them, they got tore up or whatever. That's basically what you got for the year. Again, there were exceptions to the rules depending on what plantation you were on. And of course, there was always, especially with the females, the fear of sexual abuse. And that would happen all the time. And it didn't matter what age they were. So women were always afraid that their young daughters were eventually going to be sexually abused. So they lived with that fear continuously throughout their lives, not only for themselves, but their children. Children as slaves, here's another one of those National Archive photographs. Fear of the KKK, of whites taking their frustration out on them. So they lived in a state of fear. And this picture really kind of depicts the kinds of things that they had to deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of their fear. The fears of their mothers were, again, that their partners, they can't select their partners, or maybe they selected their partner, but their partners being sold away or getting beat. The sexual advances that would be taken on them, being beaten and being used as a scapegoat, like an example of the women that were in the house that were the sexual partners of the master. And the fear of having children. I may be 15 years old and I've been taken sexually advantage of, and I'm pregnant. Now I'm gonna have a child that's gonna be born into slavery. And many times these women, there are many instances where women would take their own children's lives and or take their lives. They would take their children's lives because they didn't want to deal with having to deal with all the consequences that can potentially happen to their children. An example of that is that movie that Oprah Winfrey did that was called, God, it just left me. beloved. In that movie, which it's kind of a weird kind of a movie, but basically the woman killed 3 of her children. And so she was haunted with that and haunted with the fact that one of her children came back. But that happened on many plantations where they would kill their children even after they had them because they did not want to have to deal with seeing their children being raised as children. They were fearful of the children's working arrangements. You know, maybe you have a young son who's relatively feeble. Now he's got to go work in the fields, and he just doesn't have the physical constitution of other children. So they're fearful that their children are going to be overworked, so to speak. And one of the biggest fears was that their children were going to be sold away from them or split from them because of a sale and or because of, probate, so to speak, when they were inherited out to the master's family and away from their original plantation. And of course, they were always afraid that their children would be sexually exploited or abused. I can't even read the very top of that myself. What does it say at the very top? I can't read it on my screen. Something about
emancipation and reconstruction.
Okay, emancipation and reconstruction. Okay, what was going on then? What was going on with the children as well as the parents and the mother during this time? Rapid confusion, fear, brutality. They did have the freedom now to choose, but Jim Crow laws were instituted almost immediately to almost re-enslave them, or definitely prevent them from doing all sorts of things that freedom would afford them. They were fearful of white retaliation. They were fearful of an increased violence. During this time, families were reunited and or they were split. Here's an example of slaves reuniting. Okay, they know one of their children was sold to a neighboring plantation, and they knew that they would see that child maybe on Sundays when they were allowed to go to church. Now that emancipation has come, the family reunites, and or they would split. You'd have a situation where a woman had 3 children on one plantation. She was sold to another plantation, and she's had some more children. She was in love with the man that she had the children with at first, but when emancipation comes along, he decides he's going to stay with the woman that he's with on that plantation. So now the family is really split. So families would reunite, and sometimes families would split. And then many times the men, it was the first time they had an opportunity to have control over themselves, and many of them did not want the responsibility of taking care of families that he may have fathered children at several different plantations. So sometimes the men just did not want the responsibility of having to pick and choose which family he wanted to go with. He had his own freedom now, so many of them chose to be not by themselves. Movement caused fear, confusion, and dislocation of individuals and family. Okay, if I'm running because I've been beaten by some night riders and I'm running away, and I may not be able to relocate because I'm not familiar with the terrain. So it was just really a state of confusion, and people were coming and going and hiding and dying and getting hung and beat. It was just a real mess during this time period. Another very interesting factor is that families were divided along colored lines. Now this is an area that I want to tread kind of lightly in, because I could do a whole presentation on the colored lines. But within the African American community, there is this demarcation line, so to speak, based on the color of your skin and based on the fact whether you're a mixed blood or not. This was very prevalent at the time of Reconstruction and right after emancipation, because if you were a mixed blood, typically you were working within the household of the master, and if you were not a mixed blood, you were basically in the quarters. And a part of some of the policies that they used to control African Americans was to keep them divided along the lines of color. And so the lighter complected you were, the more you were a mixed blood, the more you were accepted, so to speak, into the culture, the white culture, and the less you were if you did not have any mixed blood in you. And so if you're a mixed blood, your color is not the same as someone that is a purebred African, so to speak. And so after emancipation, what happened in the Black community is if you were a mixed blood, you tended to go with where the mixed bloods went. Again, this can be depicted in that movie Queen, which was a sequel to Roots, where Queen, after emancipation, she's been in the house, she's been reared in the house, but she knows who her mother is, and her mother dies, but she's shunned from those blacks that were in the quarters, and she's shunned from the whites because they say she's black. So the mixed bloods really become a class in and of themselves. And in that movie, you see her going to Louisiana. She moves further south. In Louisiana, they had a lot of mixed bloods there, and they had societies that were called blue vein societies. And blue vein societies meant that if you looked at your arm and you could see the veins, and if you could see that your veins were blue, then you were light enough. Or they would use the paper bag as a color test to see if you were light enough to belong to these mixed blood societies. But over the years, that morphed into African Americans making fun of one another and making jokes about being light complected or dark complected. To give you an example, when I was a kid, there was a thing that we used to say, if you're white, you're all right. If you're light, you're all right. If you're brown, you can stick around, but if you're black, you got to get back. And that was a little thing that we used to say when we were kids, which is very divisive along the color lines. And it's very true. And today we deal with it less than we have dealt with it in the past. And over the generations, things have changed a little, but families were divided along the color lines. Many women became heads of their own households because they didn't have any males that they were married or jumped over the broom with. And many times you had families that had multiple children and multiple parents. My great-grandfather, Tom Johnson, great-great-grandfather, Tom Johnson, that came here, he had a son by another woman named Mary, and Mary came, and even though Zarina was Tom's wife at the time, Mary had a child by him, and she and the son came to Nicodemus also. The loss of home and limited land availability. Okay, they were immediately thrown out, so to speak. Many of the slaves would stay on with their masters and work with them as sharecroppers, but many of them that would leave the plantation after emancipation didn't have any homes, so they were homeless. And the land was limited in terms of the availability. Immediately, there was an opportunity for slaves to get some of the confiscated land that the government had seized after the war, but that immediately changed so that the war veterans would get the land. They had a limited income and limited financial security and limited education. Coming out of slavery and during Reconstruction, because they were so destitute, the government immediately created what was called the Freedmen's Bureau, so that they would provide banks for African Americans. So the Freedmen's Banks came into existence, which encouraged blacks to start saving and deposit those savings with the Freedmen's Bank. But the Freedmen's Bank, although they had branches all over the South, and they had many that were tied to New York, the whole banking system for the Freedmen's Bureau was flawed from its very beginning. So it didn't last very long, but they did provide, the Freedmen's Bureau provided public education to these children. And so the freedmen's schools that were created during this time period were really the precursor to public education, because prior to Reconstruction, education, there was no public education. If you wanted your child to be educated, you hired tutors or you sent them abroad to be educated. But after emancipation, the government created these freedmen's schools, which gave rise to public schools today. Okay, freedom, you have a choice. You have a choice in your partners. You have a choice to name your children what you want to name them. The women no longer had to fear separation from their children. And they determined how they were going to rear their children and how they were going to provide education and religious education to their children. And then they had the freedom of movement and some land ownership, especially when they came to the West and started homesteading. So from slavery in Kentucky to the freedom in Kansas, when this group of people decided they were going to leave Kentucky and move to the promised lands of Kansas and help to establish this little all-black town called Nicodemus, they were coming primarily to get the land and to experience real freedom. And Kansas never being a slave state, it was always going to be on the free soils of Kansas. So they were solicited by a town speculator and 5 ministers that started the Nicodemus Town Company. And they went to the churches there in the middle central bluegrass area and solicited people to come out, and about 350 decided they were going to come. And they joined the Nicodemus Town Company, and that gave them a town lot as well as the opportunity for the founding fathers to help them to get established on their homestead land. So coming to the free state of Kansas and becoming landowners, homesteaders was an opportunity for them to become landowners and experience real freedom, versus those that would stay in the South and struggle with the intense Jim Crow and lack of land availability. So who were these children and these mothers of these children that were born during emancipation, after emancipation, and born during slavery? So these next several slides are just going to show you some of these photographs of these children. Now, this is Emma, my great-grandmother. She had the first baby born. Her husband is seated next to her in front, and her oldest son, Henry, first baby born in Nicodemus, is in the center at the top. And to the left is her second son, who is Charles. That's my grandfather. That's my mother's dad. And to the right, next to Henry, is his sister. She's got short hair. She's got a black dress on. She is the mother of Verl Schweiter's mother, Ora Schweiter. And then standing in front of her is her other son. His name is Neil. And so most of the descendants in Nicodemus today, many of them can trace their genealogy back to this family. And this family grew, and a lot of families married into the descendants of this family. But this is the first baby born in Nicodemus, born free. All of her children were born free, although she was a former slave. Mother's thoughts and their feelings. You know, the first time these mothers are giving birth to these freeborn children. You can imagine what it was like for their pregnancies, as well as their birth, as well as rearing these children for the first time. And they're on free soil. They didn't have these children in the war-torn, gym-infested slave, remembering all of the slave past there in the South. They were born in a free state, on the free soils here in Kansas. So psychologically, that must have been a wonderful thing for them to experience. I'm sure they felt great jubilee, knowing that they had come out of the institution of slavery. The photograph here is my grandmother and my dad as a little boy. So these photographs are typical of the photographs that we have in our collection of these children. So I'll just kind of go through them, and when I get finished, we'll take on some questions and answers. This particular photograph is on the front of the book called Children of the Promised Land. It's one of my favorite photographs. I have two of them that I'm really partial to, and this is one of them. I don't know the name of this little girl. We have a lot of photographs that are not identified, but many are. And you will also see two types of photographs that were taken in studios, and photographs that were taken individually by people that had cameras and or traveling photographers. So I started out with the infants. And this is really interesting because if you think about it, these are former slaves. Now they're on the high plains of Kansas, and they're having their first and second generation of children. And to have their photographs taken was extremely important to them. You think about the availability of and having access to studios out in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. But when they had an opportunity to get their children's photographs taken at a studio, they did, because it was important to them. Obviously, this particular photograph was not, it was taken by someone who actually had a camera. Sweet children, sweet photographs. There's that photograph of one of my favorites. Again, the expense of having a photograph taken in a studio must have been an expense. It's something that obviously, if you could afford to do it, you did it. But you think about them being in a rural environment, pretty much isolated, but having the opportunity to go to some of the area towns and get photographs taken. So it was important to them. So they would spend the money to have their children's pictures taken. They were proud of their children. It was the first time they didn't have to really worry about them. And so they loved them. They cherished them. These are photographs that are taken of siblings. That's my great grandmother, Annie Bates, and two of her daughters. These are my great aunts. Oops. Here's some country bumpkins. Right there in Nicodemus. The little girl with the finger in her mouth, I believe that's me. Those are my sisters and brothers. That was us living in Nicodemus. This is us after we moved to California in the 50s. That's me with my dress, holding my dress out. These people not only took pride in their children and wanted to have their photographs taken, but they did their best to dress them as finely as they possibly could. Again, this is a rural environment that these kids are growing up in. So these photographs are not depicting necessarily what it was like in an urban area, although clothing was important to them, as well as taking pride in making sure that they got their children's photographs taken. This little photograph is about 2 inches by about 2 inches square. It's an amazing photograph. I feel very, very privileged to be able to collect this particular photograph and donate it to our collection. It's one of the neatest photographs that I think we have in our collection. Her little glasses, her dress, her hat says so much about her. Kids just having fun. This was probably a graduation photograph. The little black boy there on the left is my great uncle. He went on to become one of the head printers at the Kansas City Call newspaper in Kansas City. This is school teacher in the 1915 class of the Fairview School, which is 1 mile north of Nicodemus. And I'll end with that little photograph of me as a young girl living in California. I think that's my kindergarten picture. All right, this pretty much concludes my presentation. I think we have time for some questions, so feel free to ask any questions that you want along the lines of the history and or anything particular as it relates to slavery versus emancipation and what have you. I guess we can take the questions in the, or we can open it up for discussion. So however you guys want to do it.
So if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat and I will ask Angela the question.
I would be interested to know about the population of Nicodemus now.
Right now, I think we're about 22 people. A couple of years ago, we were down to 12, believe it or not. And I was beginning to freak out. I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? But what's interesting is just today we had a meeting with the National Park Service. And of course, the National Park Service is going to be reopening the visitor center. They're saying sometime in March, which is going to be good. We've continued to have visitors even throughout the entire COVID. You know, the visitor center was closed, but we still had people that were driving by and stopping in, driving through the town and what have you. But, you know, one of the big questions over the last 15, 20 years is what's going to happen when there's no more people living in Nicodemus? And I've always maintained as long as there's a Nicodemus, there will be people. But I was in doubt of that a couple of years ago when we were down to 12. Right now, there's a resurgence of my generation coming back and living here in Nicodemus. And I'm a real estate agent, and I'm proud to say that I just sold my brother, who lives in Belgium, a home right there in Nicodemus. It's one of the newer homes that was built in the last 20 years. And so he's moving back from Belgium, he and his wife, and they're moving literally to Nicodemus. And that's wonderful. And I have my youngest sister is actually moving back before the end of this year. And over the last couple of years, we've had 3 other people move back to Nicodemus. So I say as long as there's Nicodemus, there will always be people and descendants that want to live there. So I moved back in 1989. I don't actually live in Nicodemus. I have the restaurant there, though it's been closed. The population, I believe, is going to be on the rise again.
Do they have a national park person that is paid like a ranger?
Yes.
Park
Yes. As a matter of fact, now that the Park Service is back, so to speak, for 2 years, the Nicodemus Historical Society ran the visitor center. And we terminated our contract with the National Park Service last September because we just felt like we weren't getting the support we needed to collaborate collectively. So we just, and the monies we were getting was a fraction compared to what they pay their staff. And so we just let them take the reins again, and we'll continue to do what we need to do as the Historical Society, and we'll work with the Park Service. But they just hired Lucretia Horn, who is the daughter of Johnella. Johnella just finished her term as the town trustee, and Johnella headed up the tiny house project here in Nicodemus. And so her daughter was our first descendant that became a park ranger after Nicodemus became a National Historic Site. And they just hired her as the park ranger, one of the park rangers here at Nicodemus, now that the Park Service physically is back on the town site. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to get a descendant in a place with the National Park Service, so that we will always have that representation as from the community as a descendant working for the Park Service. So we're very proud to announce that, you know, she just started working with the Park Service just this month. So we're excited about that.
We drove to Nicodemus and there weren't very many houses there, maybe 10.
Yes.
Are houses out further out from the town, or?
Well, the town itself really doesn't have that many houses in it, but they have the housing complex there, which has 10 units. So there's people that live in the villa, as we call it. And then there are just about 4 or 5 houses that are occupied. My sisters and I own a farm, our parents' farm, 1 mile to the north. Another descendant lives in another 2 miles past us. So the overall population of the Blacks that are descendants that live in the area, many of them live in town. They live in Hill City. Some live in Palco, over in Stockton. So in the area, it does include what we would include our descendants that live in the other neighboring towns. But actually on the town site, there's only about 22 people that live on the town site.
Is there actually a government, a community government of any kind, or?
You know, just like any other township in the state. You know, the state is broken into counties, and counties are broken into townships. And every township has a township board. They are elected officials. They are, Nicodemus is unincorporated, so we have the township as the government, so to speak. So you have a town trustee, you have a clerk, and you have a treasurer. The funding from the county through taxes, but that's typical all over the state of Kansas.
So are many of you still farming the land and making a profit?
A very interesting question. I'm going to be speaking tomorrow about African-American women in farming. And unfortunately, over the years, the land has gotten out of the families. And the last big farmer died a couple of years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago now. And that was Gil Alexander. And he and his sister were a part of the Alexander farms. They were the big farmers in the area. But when they both died, all of the land was lost or sold. And the nephew of Gil Alexander and the son of Sharon, his sister, both who are deceased, he now lives in the house. He's the one that lives 2 miles north of our farm. He doesn't farm. He has a restaurant in Hill City. And so there really aren't any, I think there may be a couple of cousins that own land, but they don't farm themselves. They lease the land out. So there's just a handful of us that are actually still owning farmland, but we lease the land out. We lease our land out. I always like to tell the story about how my cousin Johnella says that she told me several years ago that I was a farmer, and I said, oh, no, I'm not. She said, yes, you are. And I said, no, I'm not. I don't farm anything. She said, do you own a farm? And I'm like, yes. And she says, is it farmed? And I'm like, yeah, but it's leased out. We don't do the farming, but still we're considered and classified as farmers. So to make it legal for myself and palatable for myself to be called a farmer, I decided I was going to grow lavender. So the first year I grew it was in 2019. I got my first crop, but it did not survive the following year. So I planted more plants, replanted more plants, and they did not survive, and it was something that I did wrong. But this spring, I'm going to be planting more plants. I'm not giving up. So
Lavender's tough. I lose mine a lot. Our winters are so cold.
Oh, I know. And out here in Northwest Kansas, it's really a challenge. But
Yeah.
Wilfred, who I get the plants from, and he's the main one in the state of Kansas that provides a lot of these farms with lavender, or if you want to set up a lavender farm. He's been more than supportive, and I told him I'm determined. And what happens? I'm going to be planting more. Well, I'm tough. So I'm not going to give up. So
are there any original like homestead land, like the 160 acres? Any of those parcels still together?
I'm not sure exactly if they. Well, I know there's probably 2 that I can think of right off the bat. But the land that, the farmland that my sisters and I inherited was an original farmstead. It's 40 acres, but it was an original farmstead in Nicodemus. And
Okay.
it has a barn on it, and it's the only barn that's left in the Nicodemus Township from all of the original barns. So it's registered with the Kansas Barn Association, and a couple of years ago, we were a part of the barn tour that they had.
Did you ever think of making a replica of the sod houses that they lived in when they first got?
Absolutely, we're going to be taking on that project. As a matter of fact, we talked about that at one of our Historical Society board meetings about a month ago. And we've got the land and the permission from my cousin to do it. We were going to do it a number of years back, and it just never happened. but we're putting silhouettes, metal silhouettes in and around the town. And one is going to be placed where we're going to build this dugout and sod house right on the town site. So even though we're tiny, and there's a handful of people, we're all workers that work hard, and we love to see things come to fruition. We're not just procrastinators, we make things happen, even though there's just a few of us here that are the movers and the shakers.
So is there a hill in the town that'll make it easier to build this sod house in the inside a hill like they?
It's believe it or not, it's on an incline, but some dirt will have to be moved to build it up and that type of thing. But I don't think it's going to be a big deal because it's not on completely flat land.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your history with us. It was just truly a blessing to just kind of hear. I am a younger person, so it was nice to just kind of see how far we've come and how to continue to be appreciative. And I think that more of the younger people need to have more of that experience. So I'm grateful that you are, doing your best to preserve it, because I think if we realize where we came from, it'll just help us in the days that we're in and the days that are to come. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's important for us to dispel a lot of the myths, get rid of a lot of the fear by trying to understand things and expose ourselves to things that we never even thought of. I've given this presentation many times now, and I've even had African-American women say to me, I never thought about what it was like for those women. Some things are very obvious, but you think about, what it was like to have a child or have several children that were born into slavery, and now you have a chance to continue to rear those children with new children that are born into your family, and just the dynamics of that, having a sibling that had endured slavery versus a sibling that had never experienced it. So it's good to be able to kind of dig into our past like that and understand it, not necessarily get mad. We did not endure it, and it's very insightful, but we did not endure it. And we that are alive today were not masters and did not own slaves, and we that are African Americans have not spent one day in chattel slavery. But we are all suffering the post-traumatic slave syndrome as a result. But it's good for us to keep the dialogue going and have an open mind rather than being critical or becoming angry at the things that happened in the past, but look at them and just try to understand how they've impacted us today. And I think if we can do that, we will be making great progress towards inclusivity, and I think that's what we need in this country. Is we're all immigrants to this country and descendants of these immigrants. And we need to understand that we are a nation of many. And I think to provide this kind of insight lends itself to better understanding. So I'm always grateful to be able to have this opportunity to discuss these kinds of things. Any other questions or comments?
So was your great-grandmother one of the first women families to come to Nicodemus?
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
Do you have any family folklore of how they survived that first winter? We just read in our book club here, The Healer's Daughter. By
Charlotte Healer. Yeah, by Charlotte
So we
Healer.
were first winter where they just literally dug into the sides of the hill to survive them. Do you have any family stories about their first couple of years in Nicodemus?
Well, it was, yes, and it was very difficult for them. And of course, my grandmother, great-grandmother, her mother was a midwife to her. And so, you know, she was born, they built the first dugout once they got here. The first dugout that was built once they arrived was a dugout for their family because she was pregnant. And it was difficult for them to survive that first year. They said if it wasn't for the Native Americans, they say in particular the Osage, although the Potawatomis also claimed that they were here. If it wasn't for them and some other people that came down from Bow Creek to share some of their supplies and game, they probably would not have survived that first winter. So yeah, we've got stories of how the Native Americans came and how difficult it was for them, and you know how they didn't have. There's a story about my great grandfather, John Samuels, and his son-in-law, my great grandfather, leaving. They had settled south of Bogue and about 8 miles from Nicodemus. And that's where the last group actually came and settled, was south of the town of Bogue, which was not even in existence at the time. But they went they walked to Waukeeny, which is a good 20 miles from where they were, to get corn, to get flour or cornmeal. And because they were starving and they needed some subsistence, I can't talk. And so they walked and they got caught in a snowstorm. And the family, you know, agonized for days. It took them 4 days to get back. And but they did, and they got flour and cornmeal, and they survived. And there's stories about, you know, the fires, the prairie fires, and several people getting burnt, and there's all kinds of stories about, you know, what it was like. It was just difficult for them. And the stories were passed down through the different families. I mean, there's all kinds of stories in terms of how people survived and different things that actually happened.
Well, did you write a book with some of these stories in it?
Well, what I've done with my children's book, and I'm hoping with my retirement and hopefully my health will hold up and I'll have an opportunity to write a lot more. With my children's books, what I try to do is recreate what it was like. And the first stories were kind of centered around the historical buildings. So the very first story that I wrote was centered around the post office, St. Francis Hotel and Post Office, and what it was like for them to get mail, and how they had to walk 2 days over to the railhead at Ellis, which is 35 miles, and then walk back 2 days, and how difficult that was, and eventually how the mail service evolved into, you know, a stagecoach line that went east and west and north and south along the Ellis Trail that we're trying to get designated. So I tried to take some of the stories that I've heard and some of the stories that have been written and tried to incorporate those into children's stories so that it's easily understood, not only by children, but by adults also. But I have several books that have been in the works, and I'm trying to get some of those written. I have a full script for a movie or a documentary series, not necessarily a documentary, but a full-length mini-series. And I had it looked at back in the 90s by TNT and by Disney. But the industry is very volatile. I don't know what's going on now, but hopefully someone will come along and they'll be interested in the movie script, which tells the full story through the eyes of both of my great grandparents, John Samuels, great grandfather, who was owned by Vice President Richard M. Johnson's daughter, Imogene Pence, and Tom Johnson on my mother's side, who was actually owned by Richard M. Johnson. And so it's their story from Kentucky coming forward with the settlement of Nicodemus and the generations that follow.
Do you have any like letters or drawings that have survived from that first?
Yes, the main one is a document that was a manuscript and some stories that were collected by a cousin by the name of Lula Craig. The children's book you may be familiar with, Wagon Wheels. There's a compilation of stories in that little book about the Moldy Boys and the Indians coming. That came out of, those stories came out of her document. She was about 11 when she came to Nicodemus, and she recorded the history and the stories of the people throughout her life. And my children's book, little Nicodemus Annie, who was really me, gets taken back in her dream and gets an opportunity to see Nicodemus in its heyday and as it was being established. And it's based on her being taken back by her great cousin Lula Craig. So some of these stories are depicted in the dreams that little Nicodemus Annie has. But right now I'm working on a proposal for the Regent's Press to take Lula Craig's manuscript and supplement it and enhance it with historical documents that we have at the University of Kansas, as well as some of the research findings that I have uncovered over the last 20-some years. So haven't finished the proposal just yet, but I'm hoping to have it done and submit it by mid-March. And whether it gets selected to be published or not, I'm going to continue to do the work and make sure that I can unload my brain and my research so that it's a more comprehensive history and it's up to date. So look forward to that. Hopefully it'll happen, within this year.
So are there any more questions for Angela? Well, I guess we're all done. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation. Wonderful information. I really enjoyed hearing everything you had to say.
And I would encourage you all to check out the Nicodemus Historical Society.org, our webpage. There's filled with interviews, photographs, histories, genealogies, and we even have a gift shop. So there's videos on there from clips from videos that have been done here as recently in the last 6 months. So if you check out the Nicodemus Historical Society.org website, you'll find more than enough information on the history of Nicodemus. And I thank you. I thank you very much for allowing me to share this history and be with you all this evening. I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful job.
Yeah.
Stay safe, guys. Stay warm.
Stay safe and stay warm.
Huh?
What's the Latin person in our book club?